Howdy, historians. Mr. Montgomery here, getting ready to take you through today's flipped lesson for the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation, this is the first government of the United States. Shock your parents today. Make them look foolish at the dinner table. Ask them this simple trivia question. Hey, mom, dad, parent, guardian, adult that thinks they're smarter than me, what was the first government of the United States? They'll probably mumble something about colonialism or we had a different government. And then you can shock them by saying, no, the Articles of Confederation were our first government. Show off your history street credit, show off the knowledge. But the Articles of Confederation, they're our first government. They're going to be really flawed. They're going to be bad, which is why eventually we're going to get the good in the U.S. Constitution. So for today's lesson, we're going to take a quick look at state government, some of their impacts on how they write their constitutions. Then we'll look at the Articles of Confederation, their overview, their structure, a few of their accomplishments. There's not many. All the flaws that they're filled with, and then, of course, connect it ahead, looking at the next unit. Now, a couple reminders as we get going here. Number one, make sure you have the vocabulary list finished from your flip lesson guide. Be sure you have your flip lesson guide out so you can use the outline to take good notes, and then answer the 2 summary questions found at the end of this presentation and on your flip guide, so that way you are ready to go for discussion and assessment tomorrow. So, let's go ahead and hop into it here. State governments, how are they impacting the development of the federal government? Well, first off, it's important to understand that each state actually writes their own constitution. As the war gets going, the Second Continental Congress says to all the states, hey, you got to create a constitution. You got to create yourselves, basically, is what they're telling them, because before this, they were just colonies. But now they're saying, no, you got to create yourself as a state. You got to make a constitution. So when they start to write these things, Massachusetts does everybody a solid and says, hey, we know how to do it. What we're going to do, we're going to have a convention. We're going to have a bunch of people get together and talk about what our government should be, debate, and then ratify this document. Because ever since we started off as kind of America in the colonies, we've liked to get together and talk about important stuff, whether it's the Albany Congress, the Staten Island Congress, the First and Second Continental Congresses. We like to get together and chat. Massachusetts lays the foundation, and then everybody else has a convention, and they start writing and adopting various state constitutions and actually creating themselves. I have Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina down here because they're the only 3 states that adopted their constitution through voter ratification. Power to the people. So as these state governments are creating themselves, writing constitutions, of course there's going to be debate breaking out because it's an issue that has 2 sides, and whenever that is present, which is pretty much any issue in the history of all history, you're going to have people take different sides and start to debate one another. The debate that takes place here is like a lot of debates today. It's between conservatives and liberals. The conservatives want a government that can maintain law and order. They want good laws that are then put in place in an effective way without a gross exercise of power, without an arbitrary abuse of power. So they just want a functioning civil society. Whereas liberals really want to make sure that they have a government in place that's going to protect their personal freedoms. It makes sense why you have these 2 camps, and it makes sense why their compromise and their meeting in the middle is going to shape our government. We're going to have an effective government that will be able to maintain law and order while also making sure to observe our individual rights, our individual liberties. So eventually these 2 sides are going to reach a compromise, and they're going to come up with some pretty solid common features at each one of these state constitutional conventions. All of these constitutions will have voting. They're all going to have a list of rights. They're all going to have separation of powers. Many of them are also going to have very weak executive and judicial branches, which makes sense in lieu of King George III, Lord North, Admiralty courts, the Administration of Justice Act. This is the arm of tyranny, so it makes sense that they would limit the power of both of these arms of government. Where they really make things strong, where they put the most power, is in the legislative branch. This is the power of the people at work. The legislative branch is supposed to be the most representative, the most in tune with the people, because they're constantly being voted in and out, and they're the biggest portion, so they can have the best representation of the various beliefs, customs, and attitudes and attributes of the American citizens. So it makes sense that they would rest the majority of the power in the legislative branch. So they come up with their state governments, and they're great, and we're going to copy a lot of their ideas, but now we need the big government on top. We need the Articles of Confederation looking down on the other state governments, so that way we can have an orderly government that isn't just 13 semi-autonomous states, although that's basically what they're going to create in the Articles of Confederation. So it gets going with John Dickinson. He's a pretty solid writer. We know him from Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. So in 1776, they're like, hey, John Dickinson, you've got an awesome hairdo. It's powdered white. It looks like a wig. You've got the receding hairline. You look English, so you must be smart. Why don't you write us the Articles of Confederation? And he obliges. But the problem is they're too strong. So Congress tweaks his Articles of Confederation, and they give the states more power. Once they have settled that, then they push it out to each state for ratification. Now, the process is going to take a long time. They pushed the document out in 1777. It takes 4 years for it to eventually be adopted because we need to figure out what's going on with all this land in the green. All this land is there, but no one really knows whose it is because all of the states simply didn't really have western borders. They just thought that they would continue along and just make these giant, very stretchy, very horizontal states. So we can see that Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, everyone is claiming this land. What eventually happens is everyone gives up their claims. They cede the land to the new government that they're creating, and then as soon as we have the land disputes resolved, everyone's happy, everything's hunky-dory, and we get the Articles of Confederation ratified. Hooray! But the problem is the structure is not very good. First off, we start off with a unicameral legislature. Within that unicameral one-house legislature, each state has one vote, and to get anything done, you need 9 out of the 13 states voting yes to actually pass something. That's about 70% of the states agreeing to something. That's really hard to do. Imagine the deadlock we would have in Congress today if 70% of the House and the Senate had to agree on something for it to pass. To make things even worse, to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed unanimous consent. We wouldn't have any amendments to the Constitution if you needed unanimous consent. So we can see from the structure that there are some serious problems here. There's not a very good distribution of power, and it's not very representative, but they're trying to set it up so it's weak. They're trying to make it so that way this federal government doesn't have too much power of the states. Because let's remember, they just got done with the imperial crisis. They know what arbitrary centralized power is all about. So they want a weak federal government where the states can have the majority of the power. But unfortunately, that's not going to work out well for them. To go along with this weak government, they give them a pretty weak list of powers. Yay, we can declare war, we can make treaties, we can send diplomats abroad, and we can borrow money. That's about it for their list of powers. But once again, it makes sense. This is supposed to be a weak centralized government that gives the majority of the power to the states. But there's some serious flaws here in the structure of this government because there's a lot of powers that have not been given to them. They can't regulate trade and commerce. They can't raise taxes. They can't pass tariffs. They can't put in trade barriers. They can't issue money. There's no executive branch. There's no judicial branch. There's no power to enforce its own laws. So the powers not given to the Articles of Confederation vastly outweigh the small amount of powers that were actually given to them. So they're basically set up for failure from the beginning. If you can't regulate your economy, forget about it. Things are not going to go well for you as a government. You've got to be able to regulate the economy. But there's this great divide here of we want to make sure we have a government, but we don't want to give it too much power because we don't want to fight another revolution. And if we want a quick summary here, here's a nice little chart. 7 weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the problems that they cause, the outcome. Hit pause in this bad boy real quick. Jot this down into your notes. Quick example. Weakness. Congress had no power to lay or collect taxes. Outcome. The government was always short on money. The debt is going to be a major problem here. So hit pause. Jot down this chart. It'll give you a quick little reference here for our weaknesses and the problems that they create. Now, despite all of the weaknesses of the Articles, the lack of powers they're given, they're actually able to accomplish 3 pretty important goals. And I would say the first one is not pretty important. It's really important because they win the revolution for us. So, hey, yeah, you may be a flawed government, you may be weak, but at least you were able to help us achieve our independence. I'd say on the list of things, I'd just throw a wild assertion out there and say this is probably like one of the most important accomplishments of all time in American history. So well done, Articles of Confederation. So they win us the revolution. They also get us a pretty good treaty in the Treaty of Paris as well. Very favorable treaty. Then they're going to actually be able to pass two pieces of legislation despite the huge uphill battle for doing so. The first is the Land Ordinance of 1785. Now this sets up a policy for surveying and selling Western lands. And what they decide is that as they survey and sell these Western lands, they're going to use the money to pay down the national debt. So that's actually really solid. Good job, Land Ordinance of 1785. They even set aside one section of land in each township that they create for public education. So we can see a huge precedent set here for public education in the United States. So Land Ordinance 1785, surveying, selling land, and then paying down the debt. Then we have the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Important for later, but not for right now. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 forbids slavery in the old Northwest Territories. The old Northwest Territories are where we are at right now. We can see them here. It's, Michigan, Upper Michigan, parts of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. So they forbid slavery there. Also, what the Northwest Ordinance does, it decides how a territory is going to become a state. Two parts. Part one, you become subordinate to the national government. It means you follow their laws and accept their authority. Part two, you get 36,000 people to show up in your territory, and you can become a state. I just had to pause it because I was sneezing. My apologies. So first you become subordinate to the national government, then you get 36,000 people, and boom, you can become a state. And not only are you a state, but you have equal rights to all the other original 13 states. And these two pieces of legislation were really important. What Congress had done, what the Articles had done, they had neatly solved the problem of westward expansion and basically a Western empire as we move out into this vast expanse of open territory. I mean, there could have easily been a future revolution between East and West, primary states for secondary states. But instead, they come up with this really solid scheme that works so good, we basically keep it going after we get rid of the Articles of Confederation and start using the Constitution. So they don't have a lot of power, but they're actually able to get a few things done. Now, eventually, we're going to see some very serious domestic, foreign, and financial problems start to bring the Articles down. And we start with financial problems. It's really simple. The Articles have no taxing power. They can't regulate trade. They can't regulate commerce. So things are not going to go very well. They can only ask states to donate money. I mean, I could ask you to donate money to pay my salary, but let's face it, you guys aren't going to do it. It's your money. A couple of you may, but it's not going to be a lot. You can't just ask people for money and expect to be able to, go effectively regulate your economy and provide services to your people. So the fact that they can't raise any money is a serious problem. Debt is just enormous. It's constantly getting bigger. To make things worse, states are issuing worthless paper money. It's bad. Foreign powers also realize we are weak. We're growing up. We're having growing pains. They're not sympathetic. Spain and England are still all around us. Russia and France are still kind of around too. And we're worried that if we don't get organized and get our stuff together, one of these countries could come in and we're fighting American Revolution V2 or going back into some weird stage of colonialism. Could have been really bad. And then the third major problem, domestic issues. It all deals with Shays' Rebellion. Now, from your readings, you know what's going on in Western Massachusetts, 1786. Debt-ridden farmers getting all crazy, taking over courts, causing chaos. What we see with Shays' Rebellion is people realize we need a very powerful or more powerful centralized government. The government was not able to effectively deal with Shays' Rebellion. I mean, courts were shut down, skirmishes were fought, men died. And what people start to realize after Shays' Rebellion is that we can't allow mobocracy to take hold. We need to make sure that democracy is checked. Otherwise, the country and the government could be held under ransom by the tyranny of the minority. People had to respect law and order. They had to respect the government, and the government has to provide that security, that basic law and order if the young republic was going to be able to live on. So it's Shays' Rebellion when we realize we need something better. Mobocracy can't take hold. This centralized government is too ineffective. It's too weak. And Shays' Rebellion is the event that pushes us towards something new. So what a bunch of smart people realize is we need to do take two on creating a national government here. So eventually, George Washington calls for something called the Annapolis Convention in 1786. Now, unfortunately, unfortunately, only 5 states send delegates in 1786. But out of the 5 that are there, there's some important people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And what they convince everybody is that they're going to come back in Philadelphia and they're going to have a convention dedicated to revising the Articles of Confederation, which is then going to lead us to the Constitutional Convention, which will be where we turn our attention to next. So we can see with the Articles of Confederation, it's a good try. They're trying to set up a weak government so that way states can have more power, but eventually it's too ineffective. The powers not given to them vastly outweigh the powers actually given to them. And then when we have the big event of Shays' Rebellion, people realize the government is ineffective and that we need something better. And that will lead us into the Constitutional Convention. So be sure that for tomorrow you have your vocabulary done. If you have any questions, bring them to class so that way we can discuss them. And then also make sure that all of your notes, all your summary questions, you bring them as we will discuss them in class tomorrow. So here's your first flip lesson. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time. Peace!